A mysterious island that was once blighted by disease.
And the legend of her death still haunts the island. And some of the locals refuse to visit this place.
A pioneering complex associated with both glory and tragedy.
It's quite a mysterious place as well. The tragedies which happened here throughout the last century really also are kind of a mirror of our past.
A shipping juggernaut that met a dramatic end.
This ship is clearly one that means business, but it should not be on these rocks.
And an abandoned masterpiece built by one of the world's greatest engineers.
He had a solution, but what he was proposing was considered by some to be both extreme and dangerous.
Some are engineering marvels that have been abandoned. Others are ruins shrouded in mystery. But each of these crumbling structures bears the marks of history. While some are associated with dark times, they are all reminders of human ingenuity and endeavor. Now, each haunted shell can be revealed to tell its own unique story. In the Brandenburg district of West Berlin is a unique complex that was once the center of the world's attention. Now, it's a largely forgotten ruin.
Few Germans realize that the site even exists. It's almost as if it's been forgotten on purpose.
There's a swimming pool, now empty and silent.
There is nothing quite so eerie as standing where there ought to be 11 feet of water, and instead there is nothing but a still, chill air.
A pommel horse stands alone in a deserted gymnasium. Pleasant grassy areas stretch out before carefully positioned huts with verandas.
When you look at this place, in all of its green and grassy, low-rise glory, it feels as though you're seeing a purpose-built company town.
But the almost utopian feel here is disrupted by military-looking murals and stark blocks which look like barracks.
They're ugly, and really, these are buildings that you don't want to keep.
The walls are covered with newspapers. When you get closer, you notice something strange about them. They are not in German.
The architecture has two distinct styles, yet every building appears to be part of a single purpose.
What this place conveys is a sense to take people's lives and mold them. It's all about people coming together for a purpose, but it is not at all clear what that purpose is.
In 1934, this site, which sprawls across 136 acres, was set to be remodeled. The man in charge of the project was Wolfgang Fürstner. This was a pioneering concept, which would play a central role in an era-defining event that captured the imagination of people across the world. Yet, just days after the project was completed, Fürstner walked out of his house and down to a lake, stood on this jetty, and put a pistol to his head.
He was in charge also of construction. He was made an outsider and really pushed so much to the edge that he decided to take his own life.
What drove this man to suicide just days after what should have been the proudest moment of his life? Jan Bejšević is an expert local historian who is fighting to preserve this unique complex.
This site really mirrors much of our past, much of the wars and tragedies of the 20th century. Many lives ended in this place. We have the beauty of youth on one side, and we have the tragedy of death on the other.
This is the Olympic Village for the 1936 Berlin Games. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933, he inherited the Games, which had been won 2 years previously by the Weimar government. Its bid had beaten the city of Barcelona. This site would house athletes from all over the world in a great festival of sport.
Now in 1936, he has an opportunity to show to the world a new and rebuilt, completely new kind of Germany.
This is going to be an opportunity for Hitler, who's been in power for 3 years, to show off the fact that Depression-era Germany is gone, the Weimar Republic is gone, and the Olympics are going to show that to the whole world.
This was Hitler's chance to show the world that a new, rejuvenated Germany had emerged from the Great Depression. For inspiration, he looked to the Los Angeles Olympics of 1932.
The Games in Los Angeles were really important for the Germans because for the first time we have an Olympic Village there, a real one. And the Germans could learn quite a lot. And everybody was impressed of what the Americans did. But still, it was easy for the Germans to take notes and to improve things.
It was Army Captain Wolfgang Fürstner who oversaw the construction of the first ever permanent Olympic Village, which was built with ultra-modern facilities to be enjoyed by nearly 5,000 athletes. They included the likes of the famous German boxer Max Schmeling, and of course, the great American Jesse Owens.
Here we can clearly see how the Germans improved by building an Olympic Village which nobody had seen so far. It's not just having little houses for accommodation, it's having real houses with a terrace for sunbathing, with a central heating system inside, and all the luxury of that period. And all the people who were here in 1936 were really impressed by it.
The athletes were even more impressed they were able to see their teammates perform live on the big screen.
These games were really also the first media games, the first real propaganda games, so incorporating everything they had. Radio, a movie, we have the 2 Olympia movies by Leni Riefenstahl, but for the first time also television. So these are the games which see live broadcast for the very first time.
Of course, Hitler wasn't slow to show off Germany's military might, as the artwork in the Village Media Center illustrates.
It was clear to everybody after seeing this mural what the propaganda was about. It was about celebrating the newly gained strength of the German military. And just some years after the Olympic Games, many European nations would exactly see the same scene, having the German army occupying their countries.
Despite the demonstrations of a new military strength, the world bought into Hitler's image of a reborn but peaceful Germany. And the magnificent facilities here were certainly a hit with the athletes. Having convinced the USA and Great Britain to compete, after both had threatened to boycott the Games, Hitler had now built the perfect stage. Only the Soviet Union and her allies followed through on their threats to stay away. Hitler successfully showcased German engineering through cutting-edge technology, including the first ever live television broadcasts. There were also innovations to the games themselves.
The Nazis were hugely into torchlight parades And the Nazis introduced the idea of the Olympic torch going from Greece all the way to Berlin.
But while the glitz and glamour of the Olympics were dazzling the world, the racial purification of Germany was continuing discreetly, out of view.
While the Germans allowed Jews to participate in the games, they were, behind the scenes, rounding up gypsies and continuing to pass anti-Semitic laws.
Wolfgang Fürstner, the man who had helped make the Olympic Village such a success, soon became its victim.
It turned out that he had a Jewish grandfather, and he was taken off the project in the end.
It was here at the lakeside, 2 days after the games ended, that a real tragedy took place. The commander of the village came down from his house through the woods and took his life with his own service pistol.
The Nazis tried to cover it up, saying it was a car accident.
However, journalists uncovered the truth. Fürstner had already been demoted, and as a career officer, he knew that his Jewish ancestry would eventually see him dismissed from the army. Instead, he chose suicide. With the games over, the village had served its purpose, and the complex was handed back to the German army to become what was always intended, a ready-made military base. But there were tumultuous years ahead, and the army's stewardship wouldn't last long.
Here we see traces of a very different army. That's the Soviet army, which took over the whole site in 1945, and which did not only leave that kind of equipment, but even their newspapers on the wall, the Pravda, the Truth, which you can still find here.
This was now a new Soviet military base.
For a period after the war, the Soviet counterintelligence agency SMERSH established themselves here, hunting for ex-Nazis. And rumors abound that the underground heating system and the swimming pool were used for interrogation and torture.
Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the complex has been left to rot. Perhaps it brings back memories that Germans would rather forget. But now the site is being repurposed once again, this time as a development of modern apartments.
You can actually see the long jump pit where Jesse Owens, one of the greatest American athletes of all time, trained, and also where the boxer Max Schmeling did his prep in the lead up to the big day. And now it's all about to be demolished.
But perhaps a future as contemporary housing might finally help lay the ghosts of the Nazi era to rest. Off the coast of Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean is a lush green island, but one with a history of sickness and disease.
When you see this island from the water, it looks like a lovely tropical vacation spot, a nice place to build a resort.
But as you get a bit closer, you see these colonial-style buildings on the shore are a little bit dilapidated. They're falling apart.
Looking forlorn and neglected, a once grand house sits by the shore. A broken pier reaches out into the water. While inland, in the jungle, there are more strange remains.
Some buildings look like they were part of an old hospital complex, or a religious site, perhaps.
It's clear there was some kind of a large compound here.
There's one part of this place that suggests those who came here never left.
You see graves, but not just a few. There's a whole graveyard. Clearly, an entire community once lived on this now uninhabited island.
Whatever happened here certainly created fear and dread among its people.
Some local fishermen are, to this day, still too frightened to venture onto the island.
It hasn't always been this way. 100 years ago, this island was a popular holiday resort.
It was previously a fishing village and a holiday paradise where people came to relax, but it became something more sinister.
In 1924, the island changed forever when Trinidad's British rulers tried to solve a tricky problem. It saw a huge influx of people arriving from the capital port of Spain. Unfortunately, they brought with them sickness and disease. Michael Ford, a local expert, explains more.
This bay, Saunders Bay, was designated for the women, while the neighboring Cocos Bay was designated for the men. You would arrive by a launch or a schooner and have to go to this building here, where you would be administered, registered, and assigned to one of the facilities. If you were not well enough to live in the cottage on your own, you would have to be admitted to the hospital.
These new arrivals were the unlucky victims of a century of dramatic change in Trinidad. Trinidad had been a colony of Great Britain since 1814. In 1833, Britain abolished slavery, leaving the island's landowners short of workers for their sugar and cocoa plantations.
A flood of immigrants poured into Trinidad and Tobago, but with them came an influx of leprosy.
That was one of the world's most feared diseases.
Leprosy was this devastating and really tragic disease. It's caused by a bacterium that lives in the skin, develops slowly over many years. It does nerve damage, it can cause blindness, and in severe cases, it causes this terrible disfiguration of people's faces or other parts of their body.
There had been outbreaks of leprosy in the Caribbean for centuries. But by the late 1800s, as migrants from all over the world arrived in Trinidad, it had become an epidemic.
The colonial government opened a leprosarium in the 1860s, but on one occasion, 300 patients fled the facility.
There were fears that this terrible illness was running out of control. Painful, incurable, and highly contagious, it was thought that the only way to stop the spread of leprosy was to isolate sufferers. The Trinidad authorities decided to act and began to round up leprosy victims.
These lepers were taken from their homes, torn from their families and forced onto a boat, sent away to live in total isolation.
And this is where they were taken. The Shak Shak Island leper colony. It opened in 1924, and it was designed to house 300 patients, providing them with everything they needed to survive, but with only minimal contact with the outside world.
This is a completely self-contained medical facility with living quarters, hospital, laundry.
What is behind me is a typical quarters that the patients would stay in. There was something like 50 quarters like these. A typical one would have accommodations for 2 patients. Probably like some of them have small kitchenettes, running water, and a little veranda.
Although the colony provided the lepers with some creature comforts, it was an unhappy existence.
Life was not easy for these patients. Men and women were kept in separate camps, so there was none of the normal romantic or family life that people expect as part of the human experience.
And you also had to work, but you were only paid 25 cents for the whole day.
Water was very short. They only had rainwater they collected.
You weren't even allowed to swim except up to chest height, and if you broke those rules, you could be sent into even further isolation.
Worst of all, once you had been sent to Shak Shak Island, you could never leave.
They were allowed no visitors, no contact with their families or even the mainland.
So even though they were in something that looks like a tropical paradise, their lives were actually closer to a kind of a hellish half-life where they couldn't go back, they couldn't see their families, but they also couldn't start any kind of new life that would be a semblance of what they'd lost.
Today, many locals still avoid the island at all costs. Here are the remains that give us a clue as to why.
So they were cared for by a group of Dominican nuns brought from France, and these nuns had to live under the same conditions as the lepers. It was incredibly dangerous, and they suffered along with their patients.
2 of the nuns caught and died of leprosy.
And one of them actually committed suicide, which is definitely not something you're supposed to do if you're a nun. And the legend of her death still haunts the island. Some of the locals refused to visit this place, not because it used to be a leper colony, but they're afraid of the ghost of the nun who committed suicide.
It seemed the lepers of Shak Shak Island were condemned to a life of disfigurement and then death. But in 1942, there were new arrivals on the island, and things began to change. They were 1,000 US Marines.
The Americans established barracks all over the island. But one significant improvement that they did for this island, they established diesel generators. That improved conditions tremendously on the island.
For the first time, there was electricity for the leper colony. The authorities began to relax the rules, allowing male and female patients to mix. Medical advances were also being made in the wider world.
By the middle of the 20th century, treatments for leprosy were getting better. A combination of antibiotics can actually treat the disease and reduce the symptoms.
As leprosy finally became a treatable disease, it was no longer necessary to keep those affected locked away.
Also, the Dominican nuns were a declining group. There weren't a lot of new people coming into the order to replace the aging nuns who, by this time, were dying off or needed care of themselves. So eventually, the colony was shut down.
Shak Shak Island was a prison no more.
The last patient left on July 23rd, 1984. The entire structure was abandoned and left over to the elements.
Today, there are plans to redevelop the island for tourism. But right now, Shak Shak Island is still haunted by its history and tormented by its past. And its future remains uncertain. On a dramatic stretch of coastline near the port city of Cape Town in South Africa is an amazing sight.
In this area of incredible natural beauty, it's got the amazing ocean and the rocky backdrop, and then suddenly it hits you right between the eyes. That absolutely should not be there.
You're suddenly confronted by this extraordinary sight. This huge ship lies beached on the rocky coastline with this enormous crane reaching up for the skies.
Only part of this giant machine is still visible above the crashing waves. Yet, the rusting crane and turret suggest it was once a majestic vessel.
This ship obviously is built for a specific job. You've got the huge crane at one end, but this beautifully designed ship should not be on those rocks.
At sea, things go wrong. Things go wrong all the time, and that's why, for hundreds of years, there's been a healthy salvage industry, where ships that run into trouble get rescued and recycled. But something's gone wrong here. This crane has clearly been here for some time. Why has no one rescued it?
First and foremost, there's obviously been some kind of disaster here. You just want to know how this mighty vessel has ended up stranded on these rocks.
The story begins in 1994, when South African salvage expert Captain Nick Sloan received a distress call.
So we were busy in False Bay hiding with the supertanker. So False Bay is a perfect place of refuge for large ships in distress. And we knew the storm was coming, so we had suspended all operations in case we lost control of the supertanker. And then Cape Town Port Control called us up and said that the Boss 400 was drifting onto the coast.
This is the Boss 400, a French-built vessel known as a lay or crane barge. It was built to do a very specific job.
It's basically a pipe laying vessel. So that beautiful engineering is designed so it can lift up, move, and then lay giant pipeline.
You're building an oil rig from scratch, you call it in. It's a one-off machine, and it traveled the world building huge structures in difficult marine environments.
This was one of the most powerful crane barges ever built. In its prime, it was an engineering marvel, touring the globe, helping to construct some of the most ambitious projects anywhere in the world. This giant beast was capable of lifting 1,200 tons and was valued at over 70 million US dollars.
But the Boss 400 now found itself in perilous waters. Waters that Captain Sloan knows all too well.
So you got these frontal storms that come all the way across the South Atlantic from Brazil. They're already full storms when they hit the coast. And then they hit the warmth from the Gullis current, and those storms that are already bad go crazy with all the extra energy. So you don't want to be stuck in a winter storm off South Africa.
This treacherous stretch of coastline is known for its changeable weather and its violent storms. In fact, Cape Point is known as the Cape of Storms.
Crane barges are not fitted with engines and rely completely on tugboats. Pulling the Boss 400 that day was a Russian tugboat called the Tigre.
So the barge is not designed to move under its own power, and for that you need a tug. A small, powerful, maneuverable boat, and that does the hard work.
But there were problems with the tug. Not only was it dragging a huge tow wire nearly 4,000 feet in length, it had also lost its main engine.
With just the backup engine, you've got a lot less power and maneuverability, not to mention the fact that you could be left with no engine at all. And as it turned out, this was no ordinary storm.
The crew were completely unaware, but they were heading into grave danger.
The port of Cape Town was closed, but the tug still continued to make her approach inshore to Cape Town.
They then started to try and turn around, and that's when they got into real trouble. The tug crew had actually been radioed repeatedly, but because of their poor English, they didn't understand, so they carried on.
And they tried to turn around to get further back out to sea. And during that operation, that's when the tow wire sank to the seabed and snagged on the reef.
The crews of both ships were now in perilous positions. Nick's salvage teams were in a race against time as the juggernaut floundered and drifted towards the rocks.
We ran around from False Bay to try and see if we could get a line on, but in those weather conditions, even with a helicopter, there was no way we could get close to her. If you look at this now, it's summer season, you've got maybe a 1 meter, 1.5 meter swell, but in a winter storm, where the swells are actually almost up above the crane house. So that's the type of swell you're talking about.
The swells were so severe that the Boss 400, despite its enormous size, was actually disappearing completely behind the waves.
It was simply too dangerous for the salvage teams to attempt to reattach the tow line.
And we just had to sit there and watch her slowly break apart. The helicopters took the crew off, and then Mother Nature took care of her, and she ended up on top of the pinnacles that went straight through her bottom, and then she was fast on the reef.
The crew were eventually airlifted to safety, but their ordeal was far from over. When they arrived at the port of Cape Town, they were all arrested and detained pending an inquiry into the disaster. That wasn't the end of the story. A vessel of that size wasn't going to be left without attempting salvage.
That was the first attempt to try and get closer. We had to abort, wait for better weather. Then we sent in smaller boats and we sent people on board by helicopter to assess her. The tanks right on the bottom of the ship, they were all breached. If you don't succeed in that first 24 hours on the South African coast, then it's very unlikely that you're going to succeed later on.
An American company later launched another salvage operation, but without success. There was a long-running, acrimonious court case. Some members of the tug crew were held for a full 6 years before they were allowed to return home to their families.
In the investigations that happened after the event, it was found that this tugboat was underpowered and, quite frankly, just not up to the job.
It was about an $80 million insurance claim, and that's why they arrested the tug, the Tigre, and held the owners responsible. But they didn't have that type of money or insurance. So it was a total loss and a disaster from the French construction company and from the underwriters.
The tugboat was eventually auctioned off. But unfortunately, it's simply too dangerous to salvage the remains of the Boss 400. But today, the Boss 400 is not just a unique spectacle for tourists and hikers. It may well have some kind of future after all.
There's not much of the barge that has survived. The core structure, the foundation of the crane. In the next 4 or 5 years, I wouldn't be surprised if she topples into the water. It will add some value, as a recreation sport area, and you'll find artificial reef and the whole ecosystem will grow up on top of her.
In the green fields of southwest England is a valley littered with unusual ruins.
Sweeping over the stunning Cornwall countryside, you come across a grand stone viaduct that spans a river valley. But as you get closer, you see that there's something different about this one.
Right next to it, there's these series of tall columns that are clearly a lot older and have obviously got some kind of story to tell.
So for what purpose was this structure built? Why is it now derelict and abandoned? What became of it? Did it somehow collapse, or was it deliberately destroyed?
The mystery deepens as you look up and you see that the columns just end. There's no bridge there anymore.
First impressions might suggest that this was a fairly straightforward thing to build, but that was certainly not the case.
On the valley floor, you can see it's quite muddy, a bit boggy. Doesn't really look that stable a surface to build on.
Look at these tidal mud flats. Look at the depth of the earth here. This is not going to be a simple place to accomplish such a feat of engineering.
The structure that stood here was not only pioneering, it was also controversial and the subject of ridicule. But its story is forever linked to that of one of the world's greatest ever engineers. Today, a new viaduct carries the modern railway across the valley. But back in the 19th century, steam trains were helping to power the United Kingdom's booming economy. Cornwall was home to a thriving mining industry. But without a railway, the region was in danger of being left behind.
If they wanted to keep that business and keep that trade alive, what they needed was a railway to connect into the other main lines and ultimately continue all the way up to London.
Now, railways, when you're dealing with flat ground, it's easy enough. Just lay down the tracks. But that's not the case in Cornwall. You've got river valleys, you've got steep hills. This is going to be a more complicated exercise.
This particular valley was a key part of the route.
There were dozens of bridges to build, miles and miles of track to lay. But if they couldn't cross this valley, all of that was for nothing.
You have to get across the valley, and the viaduct is the answer to that.
These are the remains of the first Carnon Viaduct. The plan was to build a vast bridge some 750 feet long, supported by 11 stone pillars. It was an ambitious project. Local historian Bob Richards explains the challenges its engineer faced.
This was actually one of the deepest valleys they had to cross on the whole route, and so this viaduct itself, the track bed was some 96 feet above the valley floor.
When you're building a viaduct, you want something that's stable, you want it flat, and you want it to last. And that's not an easy thing to accomplish here. You have soft, muddy land that's over 20 feet thick in some places.
The water level was higher in those days, and it's also tidal. Not only did this make construction conditions difficult, it also put different stresses and strains on the structure. It's almost as though everything was against them.
So building the viaduct was always going to be a huge structural and technological challenge. Luckily, the man given the job of building it was no ordinary engineer, but a great colossus of the age.
At the time, there was only really one person who could solve this particular problem: Isambard Kingdom Brunel.
Brunel was one of Britain's greatest ever engineers. Born in Portsea, Portsmouth on April 9, 1806, to an English mother and a French father who was also a civil engineer, Brunel was a precocious child. He'd learned Euclidean geometry and was fluent in French by the age of 8. After completing his apprenticeship in 1822, Brunel worked as an assistant engineer on the pioneering project to build a tunnel under the River Thames between Rotherhithe and Wapping. Few then could have predicted he'd eventually be responsible for many of the innovative railroads, steamships, tunnels, and bridges that underpinned the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Brunel is probably best remembered for the magnificent Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol, which at the time had the longest span of any bridge in the world. But the railway and shipbuilding industries both also famously benefited from Brunel's great vision. In fact, a poll carried out in the early part of this century to choose the 100 greatest ever Britons placed Brunel second on the list, with only Sir Winston Churchill ahead of him. But even for a man of Brunel's brilliance, the Carnon Viaduct was a highly challenging project.
He had a solution, but what he was proposing was considered by some to be both extreme and dangerous.
Why not complete the top of the viaduct with wood instead of stone? Much cheaper, easier to work with, and you'll be done much quicker. But people wondered, would a wood structure hold the weight of a train?
Brunel designed timber trestles that fanned out from the stone pillars to support a wooden deck, which would carry the railway. It was an innovative design, and by using timber instead of stone, Brunel would certainly save the railway company money. But this was highly unusual for the time, and Brunel's plans were ridiculed in the press.
In 1860, this is cutting-edge stuff. It's scary. People don't know it's going to work. They haven't seen it. To modern eyes, we see a big, stable structure, but to everyone else back then, this is the future.
Brunel's imaginative design was controversial, and today we see that a new viaduct has replaced it.
We have these stone piers, stumps really, with nothing on top of them. Did the wood survive? Did it collapse? What happened?
Don't underestimate timber. It might not look as solid and as heavy as the masonry, but actually it's incredibly strong, and if it's used in the right way, you can transport incredible loads across it quickly and safely.
In fact, Brunel's wooden design worked. Its success was at least partly down to his work on the valley floor.
The stone piers going down under the ground to the bedrock were what took the real weight of the construction. And the wooden fan design on top spread the weight evenly across the whole of the 750 feet expanse of the viaduct itself.
The supporting pillars were made from hard rock driven deep into the ground. That was what made the whole structure so strong. During construction, Brunel made full use of an ingenious invention he'd worked with before.
He sinks these caissons, these round steel rings, into the riverbed and then pumps out all the mud and silt, which then enables your labourers to get down there and build proper masonry foundations.
Using caissons kept the foundations dry and meant that they could be placed deep beneath the unstable earth on the surface.
While the soft ground may have once been a concern, Brunel's design certainly overcame that issue. These columns aren't going anywhere for a very long time.
This Victorian masterpiece carried trains for 70 years. But sadly, its creator never saw it in operation. Brunel died before it was completed. So what did signal the end for his extraordinary invention?
Although it lasted an incredibly long time, its major downfall was the cost of maintenance, and particularly that top timber section.
In the 1930s, the railway authorities decided to replace Brunel's viaduct with a new stone structure. But his remarkable construction was one of the last original timber viaducts in Cornwall to be replaced. Today, the modern viaduct carries tourists along a branch line. But Brunel's great columns still stand beside it.
Anything that Isambard Brunel got involved in was built to last. And these are a fine example of his engineering genius and a fine example of the workmanship that went into them. The fact that they're still here 150, 160 years after they were initially constructed.
Now they're abandoned. But many were once beacons of hope and progress. Each one is steeped in history. Some remind us of difficult times, but also of human imagination, enterprise, and spirit.